Powering intra-Africa trade is no small task, and that is why African Union years back talked about an Africa Continental free trade area in a way that there will be free access of movement and there will be also good free access for trade in Africa. And we're still looking at how these can be powered 2 years on when this AfCFTA was launched. And joining me further to discuss this, we have Tego Putu, a development economist. She joins us from Dublin, Ireland. Thank you so much, Tego, for joining me on one slot.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to speak about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is quite groundbreaking for Africa and should change the lives of many.
Definitely quite groundbreaking. But before we start discussions, let's look at the trade area in Africa. And it's said that countries cannot trade without production. In your own assessment, what is the level of productive capacities in most African countries? Because before we talk about the free trade area, we need to talk about the production or the capacity of North Africa to actually produce goods and services. So what's the level of productive capacities for most African countries?
So thank you for that question. I think that it's quite complex, considering that the African terrain is so diverse and is so large. So you have some countries that are more industrialized than others. If you look at different African economies, the goods, like the spectrum of goods that are being produced, some African countries are more reliant on commodities like oil, while some are more primary good exporters, and their whole economy is centered on that. And then you have some countries like South Africa, which have slightly more industrial capabilities. So I'd say it's a very mixed terrain that we're looking at, and that's what has made the African Continental Free Trade Agreement so hard to implement, because there are so many different layers to look at and so many different administrative levels to think through before it becomes successful.
Now, let's still look at the idea of the AfCFTA, because one of the benefits we talk about industrialization, job creation, improvement of the African economy. What do you look at the idea so far, so good? How has it been able to, give us what exactly it was established for?
Right. So I think because the world has had such big challenges as of late, we've had COVID-19, we're seeing the Russia-Ukraine war, so it has really stopped the progress and the momentum of the free trade agreement. But there has been implementation in a few countries. There have been a few countries that have tried with a few products to liberalize trade between them and reduce tariffs and taxes. So this is a major component of the free trade agreement, taxes and reducing them for 90% of the goods. So I'd say right now progress has been slow, but countries have ratified the agreement, which means that many countries, I think the predominant number of countries that are part of the African Union, are saying that they are going to be part of it. And it's looking to be a 5, 10 or 13-year commitment between countries, with an initial group that has already started. So progress is slow, but there is big buy-in. So lots of hope for Africa.
I'm going to stick with the issue of compliance for African countries, because before this great idea can be established, there has to be consensus among African countries. You have about 54 African countries who have bought into the idea of AfCFTA, but somehow, just like you rightly said, it's been a slow pace so far. Do you think that the African countries are well united to bring this AfCFTA dream into reality?
Yeah, great question. I think that with a lot of agreements that are made by regional bodies as large as the AU, the idea sounds really good, but the political will to follow through is what is difficult. As we know, there's differences between what governments plan and what they would like to see, especially as a unified body like the AU, and what is actually happening on the ground. Because governments represent business interests, they represent civil society interests, they represent government planning. And so even though we could say we want this area to happen and we want reduced tariffs, different actors in the country might not want that and might impede the government's ability to enact some of these ideals that we've set at the AU. So yeah, I think that political will is something that is major.
Before the advent of AfCFTA, I mean, we have all the regional economic communities, talk about comprises, SADC, EAC. Why do we have to go for this big dream of AfCFTA where we can just stick with the regional economic communities and see how well it works? I mean, did it even go well before we started going into an Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, excellent question. I think that the regional blocs have done really well and have tried their best. And it makes sense because they are all close to each other. But I do think that the trade area, what it's trying to achieve is to be the largest trade area in the world. So that's what it is right now, because it spans over more countries than any other trade area. And also has the market is 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP of more than 3.4 trillion. So aligning our strategic plans as a continent makes more impact and is able to lift everyone out and create a sustainable development more than silos, which is what we have now. So we have ECOWAS. Up in the West, we have SADC, trading, but basically maintaining this like broken off trade between all of the continent. So the AfCFTA brings us all together, and it is a very ambitious project, but I think it is one that needs to be started.
Now, Tego, still looking at the realization of AfCFTA, there have been arguments of uneven distribution of costs and benefits, interstate inequality and uneven development. For example, reports show that in 2020, Africa imported 20 billion US dollars worth of goods from South Africa. Now, a country like South Africa, which has one of the most industrialized economy in Africa, seems to be more at an advantage than other countries in the region. What do you make of this argument, and what are the potential consequences of this for a country like South Africa or even other large trade or economic bodies, example Nigeria also?
Yeah, this I think has been a leading question and a debate. I think that the way that people are going about solving it is to continue to keep some of the world trade protections on smaller market economies and making sure that those markets don't get flooded by bigger markets like South Africa, like the goods in South Africa don't end up flooding at the market. So just protecting certain tariffs and taxes. I think that there has been a lot of technicalities to maintain some sort of equality and mutual benefit for everyone. So I think that that has been thought of if we look into the details of the agreement. And this is why it's been so important for every country to look at the agreement closely and to ratify it and to correct it and to highlight where they think that they would be losing and speak it through with the other countries. So I think that the process to the AfCFTA being taken on was really long because every country had to make sure that their interests were being protected and that as we move forward as a continent, everyone feels like they are beneficiaries of this agreement.
Definitely, this AfCFTA dream puts a lot of potentials for the youth in Africa, looking at job creation for them. What are some of the barriers or challenges you feel that this AfCFTA agreement will potentially face in the coming years?
So I think the challenges, as we have said earlier, infrastructure deficiencies between countries. So things like even if we want to have trade, do we have the necessary transportation routes? Do we have railways? Do we have power? That is a big challenge in Africa, Do we have internet connectivity? So that is a main challenge, infrastructure. And also, as we flagged already, diverse economic structures, looking at, we have very small island economies like Mauritius, and then we have massive economies like Nigeria that are highly complex. How do we make sure that these countries are both benefiting? We also have issues of implementation and coordination, also issues of political and security challenges. If we have to think about, let's say in Nigeria, the issues of Boko Haram, issues of other groups, in the Sahel, etc., moving goods, moving services, moving people. What does that mean in the context of political and security challenges? Yeah, so those are some of the challenges that we have. And it takes some time. It's a very complex region, and it will take some time for us to overcome those challenges.
I'm going to pick your thoughts a bit. I mean, when we're talking about the Africa Free Continental Trade Area, we also have situations where there have also been discussions about a single currency in Africa. And recently, Kenyan President William Ruto talked about it, that this will benefit intra-Africa regional integration in Africa, or to put Africa in the global scale when you're talking about the world trade. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel that the single currency in Africa is quite feasible?
I think it is a good ideal, but it also, as I've said before, it's a very complex, it'll be a very complex process. And I think that it is much easier said than it will be done. But I think that would take longer than a continental free trade agreement. So I think it should be part of the agenda that we set for ourselves for the future. But I think that that is less realizable than a plan like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
I'm going to go back to the issue of job creation, because it affects a whole lot of youth, it affects a whole lot of Africans, and this is what we're looking for, a situation where Africa that is so blessed, we see youths, unfortunately, complaining about unemployment. How do you think that this issue can be better resolved, and how do you think AfCFTA can better implement the issue of job creation in Africa?
I think that the So one large component of it is to look at informal trade and small, medium enterprises and look at how they can absorb it into this trade agreement. As we know, informal business, we've seen a lot of intra-Africa trade with informal businesses. And so absorbing these into the mainstream economy will absorb a lot of people into the formal economy as well. So just the recognition of informal trade, but also the exchange of goods. So if we are moving goods between us rather than exporting it to other markets where there are other players who add external profits, etc. If we keep the money in Africa, it creates different levels of demand, which helps people on the ground will help to address it. So basically, keeping the trade internally will have multiple multiplier effects for the continent, and it will affect employment. It will grow employment in the long term.
What role do you feel technology plays in boosting Africa's economy? I mean, we're in the age of, when you talk about AI, we're talking about technology advancement. For us to be able to compete globally in the world trade, we have to definitely advance technologically. So what role do they play, and how do you think African governments can help to make sure that, African countries develop technologically as it is around the world?
Brilliant question. I think technology really helps Africans to cut to the forefront. This AfCFTA, I think, an important component is technological advancement. That'll bring us in line with the global development right now. I think technology helps us to understand each other and to speak to each other more than we ever have before. But I do think a major challenge for Africans is the lack of internet. Our internet penetration is relatively low. Also, power issues, which makes internet connectivity and access difficult as well. But if we are able to overcome that, I think adoption of technological process and goods in Africa is really excellent. As we know, in Kenya, mobile money and online transactional banking is massive and has been adopted really well. So we know that the market does really well and adapts really well to advanced technologies. We just need to build the infrastructure to make sure that there's access in the region.
Earlier on, we talked about Africa's productiveness, looking at the large scale of things. I mean, for you to be able to trade, you have to produce something, and that's what we're talking about, intra-trade within Africa regional communities. That's what we're talking about. And looking at how to diversify, I mean, you talked about a situation where majorly we talk about oil, we talk about ore, we talk about, just very few things. How can African countries begin to diversify to increase the production capacity in Africa?
Yeah, so there'll need to be, again, political will to move from our primary exports. A lot of countries continue to export primary goods like fruit, vegetables, and things that are not highly industrialized. So there needs to be targeted effort to moving us from being primary producers to more industrialization. That requires planning, that requires investment. And as we see, there are different funders that are rising right now in the global sphere. We have China investing a lot of money into infrastructure in Africa, and different donors as well doing so. And so we need African governments, which I think governments have started doing, targeting funds and investments into industrial projects, long-term industrial projects, which will allow countries to move from low-value goods to being producers of medium and high-value goods.
When you're talking about these funders, you mentioned China. I want to bring in the United States, and we're talking about the U.S.-Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. It's been on for quite some time, since 2000, and it talks about providing duty-free treatment to goods of designated sub-Saharan African countries. What progress has it been with this U.S.-Africa continental trade arrangement compared to AfCFTA? How would you rate the progress?
I think that the US have been a very good investor and a large investor in Africa, although their investments come with conditions, which is why trade agreements like the AfCFTA have become important, because African countries want to be less reliant on external partners and want to start determining their own trade practices, putting their own prices, their own tariffs. And so this is what African leaders want to essentially move away from in the future, that we become our own large investors, because the case with Africa right now, I think only 14% of African goods are traded with other African countries, and most of our trade is external. So over 80% of our trade is external. So this is what we want to change. We want to make a larger percentage. I think the initial goal with the trade agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, is to push it up to at least 33%, which is about a third of the trade. And then from there, move it on and see how we progress. But yeah, we want to move away from external people determining the prices of our goods, determining the prices of our services, and bring it back home.
So finally, I want your thoughts on the AfCFTA agreement and how well we can boost Africa's economy. For you, in the next 10 years, 15 years, how would you like to see Africa's economy?
Yeah, I'd like to see us, as I've said, I'd like to see us being self-reliant, more self-deterministic, or moving towards that position. I'd like to see us centering Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist thought. And this is the Agenda 2063, to have sustainable development in Africa, to have peace and security in Africa, and to have lift Africans out of poverty so that people are able to realize their true potential and their dignity. So this is what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is about. And I think that a lot of work and technical research and technical consultation has taken place. We need political will from our governments to move it forward, and we need just investment and more strategic and targeted planning to move us ahead.
Definitely lots of things there. Thank you so much, Tego Pucci, for sharing so much light. We do hope that in the next 10, 15 years, we will see some advancements when we talk about Africa's economy. Thank you for joining us on One Slot.
Thank you very much.
Also, a very big thank you to Olishiji. I know he joined us earlier on the One Slot talking about ways to improve Africa's economy, the benefits of the AfCFTA, that is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And we must know that while numerous challenges exist and resolving these issues are needed, we would also take into cognizance that achieving this goal, Africa has the potential to overcome the pervasive issue of extreme poverty and pave the way for economic prosperity. Achieving this goal necessitates the prioritization of the continent's agenda by all relevant stakeholders, transcending individual interests and the self-centered ambitions of the privileged class. It takes all of us, it takes the political will, it takes technological advancement for this dream of the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement to come to reality. We do hope that years from now, we'll see Africa on the large scale where we talk about global trade, world trade and economy. Thank you once again for joining me on One Slot. I am Rita Modia. Till next time, bye-bye.